It's Tuesday, March 26th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. The report is called Pull Together, Addressing Housing Insecurity in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it looks at some rural communities across the province. We are digging into it in this hour, plus a look at the provincial budget, thoughts on the federal one that's coming, and we're going to use a housing filter for all of it. The big question for today, what progress is being made and what needs to be done to resolve housing insecurity? I've got just the guests lined up, funny how that works every day, to talk about this. Also this hour, we will hear from NL Housing Minister Fred Hutton. So stay tuned for that in about 15 minutes, depending on the minister's schedule. Joining me here in studio, Hope Jameson, researcher and housing consultant, Rob Nolan, CEO of Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador, and Jen Crow, Senior Director of Strategy, Fund Development, and External Relations Choices for Youth. Welcome back.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, happy to be here.
Good to see you, Adam.
Good to see you. So they had a bit of a delay. I don't know if you heard about that, but the budget ended up happening, right? Bit of goings on, but it moved along. So budget-wise, from each of your positions, how are we feeling about this provincial budget? Who wants to go first? We can rock, scissors, papers.
Yeah, I think, Adam, it was really great to see some of the investments in particular around housing. I think we can certainly agree that there was two big focuses when it came to social services and critical infrastructure in this province, housing being one of them, and certainly continue to see those investments in healthcare as well. On the housing front, this report is kind of painting this picture for sure, but investments in infrastructure, investments in repair, and investments in freeing up land for use around affordable housing is one key pillar. I think certainly for us at Choices for Youth, the other really great investment we saw more so on the healthcare side of things is investment in integrated youth services. So that model is centering on the availability of mental health primary care, housing, and other wraparound supports in several regions across Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's been a big point of advocacy collaboration with Newfoundland and Labrador Health Services and the provincial government for us at Choices for several years in partnership with 65 plus community agencies across this province. And we were so pleased to see in the budget that there's been a $4.3 million investment in scaling that model to at least 2 more regions of this province within the next fiscal year. So I think as we see, what I really appreciated seeing from this budget was there's a connection of the dots between healthcare, housing, and what is required to be well in this province, and certainly seeing some of those connection points made recently in the poverty reduction strategy as well, and the needed investments around social assistance. There's still more to be done, and we talk about that in the report as well. But these were some good strides that we saw in this budget, and we're really pleased to see that investment.
Rob?
I think from the municipal side, we're also pleased with last week's budget. So there were a few investments in community that we were happy to see. Jen mentions the intersection between infrastructure and housing in municipalities. That's a really important one. FCM released research last year, Federation for Canadian Municipalities, that estimates that about $107,000 in infrastructure is required for each new housing unit across Canada. That's an average. We expect that that's a higher number in Newfoundland and Labrador. So any investment in infrastructure is important right now.
When we say investing in infrastructure, right, 107,000 on average, probably higher here. Just be very clear, pretend I don't know anything, what that means.
So if you think about when you move into a home, what do you expect to be given to you? So many towns have water and wastewater services. So it requires the water and wastewater infrastructure to make it to that home. You have a road in front of your home. You expect your road to be taken care of, to be paved, to be plowed throughout the year. So very basic infrastructure needs. But each new housing unit, of course, needs that to be taken into account. We're also operating in what we refer to as an infrastructure deficit in Newfoundland and Labrador. And what that means is that we have aging infrastructure that either is outdated and has already required upgrading or will require upgrading soon. And our towns don't have the funding to upgrade that infrastructure. In the provincial budget, we saw $50 million in additional funding for water and wastewater infrastructure. But I'll note last week, when the budget came out, we were on our way out. The M&L team was on our way out to Central for a regional meeting. And one of the larger towns, when we brought up the $50 million, said, we just went through an infrastructure audit and we require more than $50 million in infrastructure upgrades. So, that's one town, and that's not the city of St. John's. That's just a larger town.
Right?
That's a town. That could eat up that funding immediately. So there's lots of work still to be done. We got our asks around municipal training, which is incredibly important, for fire department support, incredibly important. We got more funding for infrastructure, but we also talk about the need to do infrastructure planning, long-term planning, that will require a partnership between municipalities and provinces.
Hope?
So to pick up the baton from Jen, especially, I think the multiple areas that need to be addressed in tandem in order to resolve issues around housing insecurity is something that I am seeing and reflected in the budget, which is hopeful. So as we know, for example, we need buildings. We need literally more homes. We also need investment in supportive services that facilitate people being able to be successfully housed long term. So those mental health supports, substance use supports, all sorts of things of that nature, some of which we see reflected in the budget. And furthermore, the ability of people to afford housing is something that's very, very important to address and has been a large theme that emerged through this work. So the increase in income support, for example, is something that I'm really heartened to see. The details of that are still forthcoming, so I'm curious to see exactly how that will roll out. Something else in the budget that I'm really hopeful about, again, on the affordability side, is the fuel switching, so people moving from oil heat to electric. The cost of home heating fuel has increased radically over the last couple of years, and especially in rural areas where many of the homes are older. This is a major issue just in terms of affordability for folks. Even if their mortgage payment or their rent isn't super high, the ability to heat that home is a major challenge from an affordability standpoint. So addressing that is nice to see in the budget. So it'll be interesting to see how all these things plug into one another as we're addressing the continuum of housing from homelessness intervention right up to market affordable housing. And so I'm curious to see exactly how those things are going to be deployed and whether there's a real kind of high-level strategy around it, because I think that's really important. The coordination piece between the expenditures that we make as well as the policy decisions around them is so crucial for making sure that money is being deployed to its best possible effect. And so I'm curious to see how that comes out in the wash.
And Jen, you mentioned connecting of the dots, right? So I feel like we're hearing and having these types of conversations more from since you go back to the launch of the Health Accord, you talk about silos, talking about the need to break down silos. I do these shows fairly often, and now we have a budget and we say, hey, there's some dots being connected, and there's some stuff that looks really like it's tackling social determinants of health type level things and looking at a broad approach. Is this kind of giving you more optimism towards the folks who have, like their hands or in charge of the public purse and for the outlook for spending and planning here? Like, where are you all at with that?
I mean, I think at Choices for Youth, we continue to remain optimistic, right? We see government as our partners in this work. And ultimately, the reality is oftentimes we're sharing the same clients. We're supporting the same young people. Yeah. There's a need for us to be collaborative as we advance both system-wide change that we know we need to be kind of pushing towards, but also providing immediate solutions. So certainly there's optimism around this. I think there continues to be work to do around connecting the dots. Unfortunately, it's challenging within a bureaucratic system that operates sometimes in silos to see, mental health. We often say mental health and homelessness are two inseparable solutions. Right now, the responsibility for tackling those solutions rests within two different departments. That's not to say collaboration can't happen, and there's lots of excellent examples of where collaboration is happening incredibly well across government, but it requires a concerted effort. And I think what we're seeing increasingly, certainly the encampment situation in St. John's is an illustration, an unfortunate illustration of this. But unless we invest in critical mental health supports, substance use supports, immediate needs, basic needs, and housing infrastructure, we're not going to see us moving the dial on the issue around homelessness. And we're going to continue to see it worsen. So the question that we often pose is how might we invest in infrastructure that includes renovation repairs of NLHC units, it includes new builds, it includes getting closer to that 60,000 units that we need to build by 2030, and also pair that with wraparound supports. And by that we mean mental health supports, primary care, food security, family natural supports, and all of those things that any one of us needs in order to remain safely, securely, stably housed.
Anyone else in the?
I talked to dozens of people to write this report, and one persistent theme through, I would say, almost every single one of those conversations was a consistent call for coordinated action. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the reason we're seeing that right now is because the situation has become very dire very quickly. But that gives me hope in the sense that I think there is an appetite for everyone recognizing that we have to come at this from all corners. That's why I called the report Pulled Together, because that was a quote from a conversation I had with someone. That we all need to be pulling in the same direction. We need to be working toward that common goal of addressing housing insecurity. So that's new, right? Like that is a unified voice that I've not heard speak on this before. So I do have some optimism that things are really moving in a good direction here.
Mm. I would dovetail from that and say that I think we're cautiously optimistic at M&L about the introduction of a Minister of Housing. So this is the first time Newfoundland and Labrador has had a Minister of just Housing since 1979. And that was the only time, and it was for 1 year since Confederation, that we had a Minister of Housing. So prior to this, those intersections with other departments, I think there were 4 or 5, maybe 6 departments that housing kind of interacted with, and there was no overarching coordination within government other than Executive Council, realistically. So our municipalities would go in and have needs related to municipal legislation or related to Crown lands or related to infrastructure, and they would have to go to different departments, even though they were speaking through the lens of housing. Now this allows one ministry to be coordinating everything related to the housing lens. So I think we can be cautiously optimistic about that. It certainly allows those organizations and our communities that are trying to address the housing crisis to go to one individual in cabinet, one department, and deal directly through that lens.
Yeah, so if we talk about previous silos that could have existed when you talk about multiple departments, now having one focal point for housing, the hope, I guess, would be that that a lot of the silos could then be kind of torn down in a way so that like information flows and decisions can be made in a faster and better way. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think as a testament as well to what we're seeing from the provincial government right now, you mentioned the health accord, Adam. I think also the poverty reduction strategy. It feels like it's a call across departments to take action on the social determinants of health on both fronts, right? Yeah. On the health accord side of things, there's a real understanding and an embedded understanding in that strategy that healthcare is not just something that needs to be tackled through Newfoundland and Labrador Health Services, but rather it is something that is precipitated by things like income inequality, things like food insecurity, things like housing insecurity. And the poverty reduction strategy does the same thing. And some of the interventions that they make, Hope alluded to, increases around income support amounts, an acknowledgement of a basic income for senior citizens, for example, targeted basic income, previous investments in a targeted basic income for youth accessing residential services. There is certainly an acknowledgement that in order to invest in a healthier population and a population that is facing less poverty and homelessness, there's a need for us to tackle that from multiple departments. So certainly, I think often for folks in the community sector and beyond, the change is incremental and it's, of course, slower than we all want it to be. But it seems to me that the strategies that are being implemented right now are being implemented across multiple departments. And there's a general acknowledgement that the social determinants of health is not something that can be just pinned on one department. Rather, it needs to be a concerted effort across multiple ministries.
If I can just pick up from there.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
One of the things that consistently emerged through my conversations, especially with service providers and people with lived and living experience in this work, was the sort of two-way relationship between mental health and housing insecurity. And sometimes, but not always, mental health issues were a contributing factor in people's experiences of homelessness. But there's what we know for sure is an experience of homelessness negatively impacts mental health. And so when we're looking at social determinants of health, I think there is a call to recognize that it's important to focus on a prevention approach. How do we prevent people from finding themselves in situations of housing insecurity? So looking after income, education, employment, all these things, as well as the supply of adequate housing, is absolutely necessary for that sort of like holistic view of the problem.
Joining us on the line, Minister of Housing Fred Hutton. Hi, Minister Hutton.
Good afternoon, Adam. How are you today?
Good. How you doing?
Not too bad. Thanks for taking the time to take the call. Appreciate it.
Oh, look, thanks for coming on the show. We've talked about some of the spending on housing, the millions and millions of dollars in the provincial budget. My question for you, right? Millions in spending from your department. When you look at the range from shelters to transitional/supportive housing, right? Funding over years has not kept up with the reality of housing and homelessness. So, what's being done to make things sustainable over the long term, sir?
Well, our funding has increased this year. I managed to catch about 5 or 7 minutes of the show as we were getting to a place where I knew I had reliable service. First of all, and I did hear a couple of your guests recognize the fact that this is now a standalone portfolio. There is a recognition that housing in this province is a huge issue. That is not to say that prior to my arrival in this portfolio as the minister, no work was being done. There was a tremendous amount of work being done. And I want to, first of all, as well, say thank you to the community partners you have around the table there and Hope Jameson for her report, bringing together some of these issues, but also to the folks out there who work on the front lines on a daily basis. I met with some of them today in Gander who work at our Newfoundland and Labrador Housing Corporation office out here. And, just the work that they do each and every day is so raw and real. It's hard to remove the emotion from it because you're dealing with people who, in many cases, have a lot of complex needs. We are aware of that. And to bring it back to about the focus and the spending, it is why housing is now it's a standalone portfolio, because it is not just a housing issue, Adam. It is a mental health and a health issue. It's an education issue. It's a CSSD issue. It intersects with all these other departments that deal with folks who find themselves along that housing continuum. And obviously the most crucial and urgent stage of that is for somebody who is actually homeless. And I think that our recent budget recognizes that this is not just a downtown St. John's issue. This is a province-wide issue. And I met with the town council in Gander today. They're dealing with it out here. They've got a hub group out here as well who've got a couple of great ideas and proposals on the table on how they can deal with folks who tend to gravitate towards a place like Gander because there are bigger services available versus smaller communities that would be off the beaten path, if you will. So, I mean, just the real quick answer to your question is there is extra money. There's about $41 million in new spending alone just on that, on housing this coming year. And we recognize that there is a need, and we're acting as quickly as we can to try to address the immediate need, which is making sure that people have somewhere to stay each and every night.
Their report has a recommendation about indexing ongoing operating funding for nonprofit housing and support service providers to inflation. Is there any thoughts about doing that?
We're looking at everything that was in Hope's report, and there's so many needs. I can't give you an immediate answer on that right now, but it is certainly something that's on the table. I mean, just along the housing continuum, and as I'll go back to the early part of it, the first part of it, the most urgent is when somebody finds themselves either homeless or facing it immediately. We need to make sure that those folks are looked after as quickly as possible. The need has grown. And from what I'm hearing, I mean, obviously in my previous role, obviously aware that housing was an issue, but now it's what I'm doing each and every day. It was heightened and exacerbated after COVID. The cost of living has just, for some, has come out of control. The cost of rent is included in that, obviously. But to look at the entire picture and to back things up to 2020, and when Dr. Parfrey and Sister Elizabeth did the health accord, well-being is really crucial to a person's well-being. Part of it is fundamental in there is housing, and recognizing that need is there, working with our community partners. Our community partners, for example, pointed out that in that housing continuum, one of the major gaps that we had just in the metro region was supportive transitional housing, which is why the government is investing in that former hotel to have these wraparound supports for people, because it's all fine and dandy for somebody to just be put in a hotel room and say, okay, you got somewhere warm to stay. But not everybody can just go in there and do that and be fine. They need the wraparound supports. They may need addictions counseling. They may need mental health counseling. They can't just go somewhere if there is, triggers related to some situation to be around certain people. Every case is so unique, and it is really just a complex issue. And, I always go back to this, and it's not a cop-out. It's the fact. If there was a simple solution to this, it would not be a problem that we see in every city or town across Canada and in the United States, and for that matter, around the world.
So when it comes to the cost of living, social assistance, also minimum wage, right? Folks being able to afford rent and the efforts to make rents more affordable and have more housing available. Why is social assistance not pegged to inflation? And are there thoughts on for more increases in minimum wage? Might be outside of your portfolio, but in a time of pushing down silos, it's an important part of the conversation.
Well, and look, I'm just looking down some budget highlights, and, for starters, with Choices for Youth, $4.3 million was in there because we recognize the need, that the work that the folks at Choices for Youth does in St. John's is fantastic.
Sure, and Minister, and we've talked about that, sir, already in the show. Okay. And it just my point is that why not peg social assistance to inflation and increase the minimum wage so that you could have across the board more money in people's pockets to do things like afford rent?
Well, we've put $70 million into the seniors benefit. We've increased money for seniors and for vulnerable people. There's been targeted basic income pilots put in. We've put in, to improve income support programs. For some people, they're going to see an increase of 4 times what they were getting. $30 million for the child benefit. That's a 300% increase. It's the highest in Canada. We've increased the nutritional supplement for new mothers so that they don't age out. Their children don't age out at 1. They age out at 5, so that, this nutritional supplement is there. There are lots of things going on. We are looking at that other aspect of adding inflation, the inflationary cost to that, but it's just not a final decision at this point in time.
And sir, the CMHC number
there are a lot of other initiatives, like hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes, exactly.
Are going into this.
The CMHC number, 60,000 units needed by 2030. Have you set targets around this yet? And what's your approach for it going to be?
Well, that number, and there has been some debate around it, because St. John's did its own housing needs assessment, and the need there was around 4,000. And I think that there was some discrepancy around, I guess the population and where it was done and how Newfoundland was supposed to fit into that. So St. John's is saying there's supposed to be about 4,000, but does that mean we need
per year or by 2030?
Pardon?
Is that per year or by 2030 for the 4,000 units for St. John's?
By 2030.
Okay.
That was their needs assessment. That's my understanding of a report and that they conducted on the needs assessment for St. John's. And I think it was as a result of the CMHC report that came out.
So then, for your understanding, what targets are you setting for housing, or do you have your sights on in the coming years for this province and what's needed to be built?
Well, the first thing we're really focused on right now, obviously, is the supportive transition for supportive housing for people, with the money that we've invested in the former hotel up by the airport. But also in this continuum, our 5-point plan is meant to, for example, 100 families, and we're doing it again this year, have received a loan so that they can be part of this first-time home buyers program. So that gets them out of the rental market. As a result of getting them out of the rental market, that will free up 100 homes. That's not affordable, for folks who have difficulty paying rent, but we do have rental subsidies as well. I think there's about 27,000 families that benefit
So
from housing plans.
Overall, do you have targets set for building what you?
I don't have a target that I've set at this point. No, I mean I've been on the job for about 2.5.
Oh, I know.
weeks.
Yeah, no, you're new.
It is
I know.
Something that I'm going to look at, but I mean I just know that there is an immediate need to get people off the street, but a long-term plan is needed, and part of that is our 5-point plan. Which will free up things along the continuum, get people out of the rental markets. I mean, even out here in central in Gander, they're talking about, because industry is setting up out here through mining. As a result, people are buying up houses quickly. They're paying higher for rent. As a result, folks who are here already, the squeeze is on for them, who aren't working in that industry, and people are finding it difficult because rents are increasing, like the cost of everything. So we're dealing with this daily, trying to figure out long-term plans. There are some immediate ones that need to be done as well, and like the situation in St. John's, where we realized that we need that supportive transitional housing put in place, which is why we acted quickly to do it. And we're hoping to have that up and running within the next few weeks.
Minister Fred Hutton, thank you so much. I know you've got an appointment to get to. I appreciate you carving out time to come on the show today.
No problem. Appreciate the time. And I just, again, want to thank everybody for the work they're doing. And, we have to work with our community partners on this. We're not going to be able to do this alone as a province. We need the municipalities. We need the community partners. And I've already had a couple of chats with the federal minister. I think we've got like $65 million earmarked for housing initiatives in the province this year, just from the feds. And if there's a way we can get more, I'll work at it.
Thank you again.
Okay, take care.
Cheers. NL Housing Minister Fred Hutton there. You were listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. The big question for today, what progress is being made and what else needs to be done to resolve housing insecurity? If you have thoughts on this, The Signal at cbc.ca. The text line is open, 709-327-8206. Joining me here in studio, listening to my conversation with Minister Hutton there, we've got Hope Jameson, researcher and housing consultant, Rob Nolan, CEO of Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador, Jen Crow, Senior Director of Strategy, Fund Development and External Relations, Choices for Youth. Thoughts on what the minister had to say there, folks?
I would dovetail from the 60,000 number that you asked the minister about. And we had our own questions about that number when it came out. We've heard the province question the number. City of St. John's has also questioned the number due to their housing needs assessment. And I would say, right now in this conversation around housing, we need to go with the data that exists. And CMHC has the data right now. St. John's has a housing needs assessment. Some other municipalities across the province have housing needs assessment, but most don't. And we need to get to the point that we do have housing needs assessments right across the province. And that needs to be done in coordination between municipalities and the province to answer that question of what the needs are. That was the reason why we reached out to Hope to do this research, because we recognized over the last few years, and Adam, you and I spoke about this when I was on the program before, that there was a gap in understanding of housing and homelessness across the province, especially when you got outside of the city of St. John's. And this report has done wonders for helping our understanding in community, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in understanding what's needed. So yes, there's questions around CMHC's number of 60,000, but that's the starting point of the conversation. We know that we have great needs in housing across the province, and we need to start acting there while we're gathering the further data to better understand.
Everyone keeps saying 60,000. It's just the fact that it's just a big number, whatever the number is, right? Like the housing is needed. It doesn't matter if it's 30, 40, 50, 60. The conversation is around what's the need and what's being done, which is why we're asking those questions to the minister.
So I brought receipts, unsurprisingly. So based on 2021 census, so recall, 2020, the reference here, this data is 4 years old. Things are much, much worse than they were at the time of the census. So keep that in mind when I say this. We studied 11 communities for this project. So in those 11 communities in 2021, there was a affordable housing deficit, as in there were this many households in core housing need. They could not afford their housing. It did not meet their needs. 2,060. In 11 small communities in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. So, and that's minus that many. That we would need that many to get to zero. So
11 small communities, rural Newfoundland and Labrador. What's the number again?
2060. 2060.
2060, right? And Rob, remind me, how many communities do we have in this province, roughly?
275.
275. So 11 were looked at, and you're at 2,000 and change. A lot more communities to go to be looked at.
Yes, and that's assuming that, again, that gets us to a sort of neutral place. Mm-hmm. That's assuming nothing else changes, no population growth, no nothing. Another thing we need to be thinking about is our population is aging. As the population ages, household size shrinks, which means you need net more buildings to house the same number of people. So that's a really important thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think, absolutely addressing the stock is critical in this. Also recognizing that the cost of living has just skyrocketed in the last couple of years. So a 15% increase in rental rates since 2021, a 22% increase in the cost of energy between August 2022 and August 2023. So what we're seeing right now is those that were on kind of that cusp of vulnerability, we see this all the time at Choices for Youth. Those that were experiencing homelessness 4 years ago and those that are experiencing homelessness today, it has shifted, it has expanded, and it's because of those increases in the cost of living. So when we think about innovative solutions here, we have to tackle this from so many different fronts, right? We've talked a little bit about mental health. We've talked about infrastructure. There's also this question around income, right? So Adam, you talked a little bit about income support, increase in minimum wage. One of the pieces that there's been many members of the community for a long time advocating for through a coalition is basic income is another opportunity here. So we've seen the government acknowledge the value of a targeted basic income for a couple different demographics, but an expanded basic income could be part of the solution, not the whole solution, part of the solution here in addressing what we're seeing just in terms of massive income inequality and an inability to keep up with an increase in rental rates. So how do we think about several tools to address a complicated problem across government? That's one question. And I think the other thing that the minister hit on, which I appreciate, is the role of collaboration and the need to collaborate between community and government. So right now, Adam, we see 26% of the youth who come through our doors annually recently arrived in the city. And when you talk to them about, well, tell us about your journey. Why Choice? Why are you arriving in St. John's? Most of them tell us, oh, I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice, right? So they talk about the lack of affordable housing, the lack of supportive housing, the lack of mental health supports, the lack of basic needs supports in their community. And the only way that they could continue to pursue their goals or even and their goal might just be having a safe place to live was to move into the city. We would like to see that trend reversed. We would like to see 26% decrease in the amount of young people coming through our doors because they're getting their needs met in other parts of the province. And so if I think about the impetus for a report like this and the need for collaboration, that's the opportunity in front of us, is how do we think about not only vulnerable young people, of course, that's our purview, but vulnerable populations more broadly. How do we think about addressing their needs closer to home, which we know from national, international research, that is the best practice. Yeah. And I think that is the opportunity in front of us here. And this report helps kind of demonstrate how do we make that happen? And there's recommendations that point to the collaboration between municipalities, the provincial government, and community organizations. We have our own examples of how that's worked in practice through collaborations with the City of St. John's and Newfoundland and Labrador Housing. But we think that there's lots of interesting models that could be applied in these rural regions. And we know from the report and Hope's research that municipalities and service providers are really thirsty for those solutions and they want to have a role in this. The question is, how do they act? And I think we've been able to offer some recommendations for what acting could look like for them.
Can I pick that up?
Yes, please.
So I want to bring it back to the conversation about income because I think this is really important. And we know from a really robust body of research now that people having enough income to meet their needs yields all sorts of benefits, regardless of where that comes from. So the market basket measure is how we sort of gauge what it costs to live. So it's a modest basket of goods is what they call it for a family, 2 kids, 2 parents. That's about $48,000 and change for most of rural Newfoundland and Labrador. A family with 2 parents and 2 kids on income support makes 1/3 of that number.
Right.
So we are making a policy choice that those families live in deep poverty. A single income earner household on minimum wage is 2/3 that number. So we're making a policy choice that people who earn minimum wage are living in poverty. And the minister mentioned housing benefits, which are effectively the province will top up your income to what your rent costs. We also live in a province without rent control. And so if we introduce all sorts of measures, such as we call them demand-side subsidies, so subsidy that basically flows through a low-income person to, in most cases, a private landlord, we are moving a lot of public money to the private sector with no ceiling on the profits that those folks can make. So I think that addressing the income component through increasing income support, increasing minimum wage, looking at a basic income needs to be done in tandem with things like rent control so that materially improves people's conditions and make sure that benefit stays where it's intended as opposed to simply leading to higher rents and things like this. So I think while rent control is a complex issue, and we could have a whole show just about that. And if you want to, let's, please. I love talking about
you'll
it.
probably get an email from me at 1:15 Newfoundland time.
I'm so ready. I think that considering the ways that we look at rental market regulation is really important here as well.
If I can link that back to the conversation around sustainable communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've touched on youth leaving communities. We've touched on what happens when you have a senior population that doesn't have housing stock that meets their needs. We have the oldest and the fastest aging population in Canada right now. So a conversation that's happening in municipalities across the province is how do we retain our seniors when they are overhoused and don't have the house or the home for the next chapter in their community. So our municipalities are seeing seniors leave because they don't have the housing available to them for the next chapter. And then if you're losing youth because the services aren't there for them, and you're going to lose families because the costs are too high, then our communities are getting squeezed from all sides, and we're not going to be able to retain people. So it's an incredible concern about just the sustainability of rural Newfoundland and Labrador that all comes back to this housing conversation.
It cuts two ways too, right? Because you have seniors who are living in homes that don't meet their needs. They can't keep up with the maintenance. They have accessibility needs that are not being met. They can't afford to heat it. All of these things that are making their lives really difficult. They have no alternative within their community which meets those needs, and there is no housing stock for younger folks to move to that community to pursue economic opportunity or provide services to those seniors who need them. So we're being very much constrained by this issue, and it was a thing that came up in a lot of conversations I had, especially with service providers and municipal stakeholders, that attending to the needs of seniors from a housing perspective is a really important thing for that sustainability piece, both economically and socially.
What are some of the because it's such a big province, right? And when you're talking about 11 communities in this report that you did, what are some of the specifics on geography that really stood out to you for how when we look at the complexity of everything, what needs to be taken into account and what changes might also have to be brought in because of just the fact of how far spread out we are?
The minister actually made a sort of tangential reference to this when he spoke that people will find that housing further away from services is cheaper, but then their ability to access the services that they need is impeded, and it's really expensive to travel. They might not have access to a vehicle, and so they can't access services that they need. I recall one conversation I had with a person with lived experience who said, they've got all sorts of lovely services there, but I got no money to get there.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was a common refrain. And for service providers, too, there was a threat of not feeling like the cost of delivering service to a very large geographic area was being reflected in their funding. So, when you're being asked to service a massive area, there's a cost associated with that is different than if your entire population is in a relatively small area, like it would be on the Avalon, for example. And so people were finding themselves really struggling to be able to meet the needs of the populations that they were being tasked to serve based on funding constraints and geography.
Right. And then all of a sudden we could be into a show about public transit,
Oh my gosh, yes.
right? Which is a separate thing again altogether. Although I had
But
a
again, related, right?
But
Like
yeah, it
transportation as a function of affordability is a conversation we're just starting to have, but it absolutely, when we're looking at it with a rural lens, needs to be a part of the discussion.
I had a great conversation the other week at the Ideas Festival at Signal Hill campus, just at the Northern Peninsula, talking about using social enterprise for public transit, right? Money from the cruise ship season and using a bus through the rest of the year to bring folks from point A to B to C. And these are seniors and others who can't afford to have cars anymore. And like it's just interesting to hear some of the grassroots stuff that gets pitched and that is being done for solutions across Newfoundland and Labrador. Jen?
Yeah, I think just picking up on Hope's point there, one of the biggest barriers that we hear about a lot from our provincial partners is because services are so spread out in a given region, right? So if you're accessing housing in one space and you have to drive an hour down the road to get to your, therapy appointment, and then you have a clinical appointment somewhere else, and then you're driving somewhere else to go to the food bank, you could literally spend your whole day navigating services alone. It is an inefficient way to deliver the type of services that are so critical to an increasing number of folks across this province. So when I think about some of the best practices models that we're aware of across the country, the model that we are now picking up pan-provincial is integrated youth services. And the ability for a young person to come through one door, come through our door, they get a hot meal, they have their hot meal. They wait to see the family doctor across the hallway. Someone comes out and gets them. The family doctor's ready to see you. And then that family doctor helps shepherd a conversation around what's going on with you right now. I understand that you're not feeling well. What else is going on in your life? Oh, you're in the shelter system right now. Let me pull in a housing support worker. Let's have a conversation about getting you rapidly rehoused, right? And then there's an ability for them to access housing. If they are unemployed, there's an opportunity for them to access employment. There's an opportunity for them to get reconnected with their family if it's safe and appropriate to do so through a family therapist. So that truly wraparound model is so critical. And when we think about addressing the different life areas of a young person, we know that single point of access is what's going to facilitate that. But I don't think that that's so different than the population at large, right? We all have felt that frustration of being told, oh, you got to go this place to get that appointment and you got to call this person and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, you feel kind of defeated, right? That there's so many different systems and you need to be the one to figure out how to navigate it. Breaking down those barriers for vulnerable people is what can facilitate them attaining their goals quicker. And if you want to translate that into cost savings, we know, for example, that for every dollar invested at Choices for Youth, we're able to generate $8.93 in cost savings to systems because, again, to Hope's point, it's that preventative model. If we can say, I see that you are either on the cusp of housing insecurity or you're navigating housing insecurity right now, and I'm going to help you get the housing you need, the mental health supports you need, I'm going to connect you with a family doctor, well, guess what? Massive decrease in emergency healthcare utilization, massive decrease in ER visits, massive increase in housing stability. All of those are less costly interventions than the very costly emergency interventions that we see a lot in the vulnerable populations who we support. So how do we turn that around? How do we make it easier for people? And then ultimately, I think that's going to translate to folks being able to enter into the job market, right? Pursue post-secondary education, pursue their goals, and then also systems cost savings for the provincial and the federal government as well.
But it's about having those focal points, right, for crisis, then plans to wellness right there in one place that can reduce the time in crisis or even prevent it, which is, as you just said, cost savings across the board, right? The federal budget's coming. What, in your positions, right, when you go, okay, provincial budget's coming, we're going to see what's in, and we look at the numbers, see what, and think about what all that means. Then you're waiting, it's like, oh, the federal budget's coming, we're going to see. So where are we right now for looking ahead to the federal budget and what that might mean for each of you in this and like the work that you're doing?
I think for municipalities, it's back to the infrastructure conversation.
Yeah, because that's where the big bucks is. Is it not? Like, $50 million provincially, which might do one town's, plumbing upgrades that are needed. The feds are where the money is.
Yep. So up until this year, up until last year, we had the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, which provided money right across Canada to municipalities and provincial government for infrastructure work. That was sunsetted last year, and there's no clear renewal of that program or a new infrastructure funding program coming. So that's something that we'll be looking very closely to. That 107,000 number is a really important one in the housing conversation, and the only way to overcome that is by having a federal program. There's also the CCBF, Canada Community Building Fund, which used to be called the Gas Tax Fund, still is often by our municipal leaders and everyone who is familiar with Gas Tax Fund. That is also up for renewal. So there's negotiations going on between the provinces and the federal government on that. So there's a number of programs that municipalities are watching for that are incredibly important for getting funding to municipalities and to enhance fiscal stability.
And if you don't get that funding, what do these places look like?
That's the question, isn't it? So right now there's the WSER, the Wastewater Systems Effluent Regulations that came into effect a few years ago. Most of our municipalities are not meeting those regulations, and that sets a standard for wastewater effluent. And there are transitional agreements in place that essentially allow municipalities to have until 2030 to meet those regulations. But when I speak with a lot of town leaders, they have no idea how they're going to meet that in 6 years' time. And that's because there's no obvious funding coming down the line. And it's really all about the funding gap right there.
And is this about some like instead of just having, and pardon the crudeness of this, but instead of just having a pipe that's further out from the low high water line, one of them, something that's covered in water the whole time, for everything to go out, there's something that treats the stuff to a certain degree before it just flushes out into the ocean. And that is a very expensive endeavor for all the communities of Newfoundland and Labrador.
That's exactly right. And on top of that, there's regular monitoring and testing that is required that makes a whole lot of sense. But when we're talking about small communities that have, 75% of our municipalities have under 1,000 people and have one town clerk who works probably 2 afternoons or 2 mornings a week, when you're talking about that capacity in these communities, even regular monitoring and testing is a great cost for those communities.
Can't afford to get potholes fixed. You're not going to be able to afford this.
Exactly.
Right?
So from a housing funding point of view, thanks for setting me up, Rob. That was perfect. I think there is a widespread recognition in municipalities, in community housing providers, that the programs that disperse capital funding, so the feds are the primary capital funding provider for affordable housing in this country still. And the programs do not respect the capacity limitations of small organizations and small municipalities. They are extremely onerous application processes, which require a lot of time and a lot of money even to apply. So you're gambling, you might win, you might lose, you don't know. And so what I would love to see, and I'm not holding my breath about this, but perhaps it will happen, is a couple of things. One is funds specifically earmarked for smaller organizations, smaller regions, because the National Housing Strategy funding in general has been really slow to flow and has been primarily focused on the needs of larger communities. So I think that there needs to be a separate fund broken out for smaller communities. That's one of the recommendations in the report. But there also needs to be support for the capacity of organizations to apply successfully. So both in terms of a competence and in terms of a time and money. Those all need to be addressed in tandem for people to actually be able to get funding to build more housing. So I would love to see that. I'm not convinced that it's going to show up, but perhaps it will. And I think that, again, like the political cost of not doing anything here has become very high. So I hope that leads to some better action real soon.
Yeah, one of the areas that we get a lot of support from the federal government in is around our education, employment, and social enterprise programs. So as an agency, of course, we started in addressing youth homelessness. And we realized that in order to adequately address youth homelessness, we needed to invest in all kinds of different areas, education and employment being one of them. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have some of the highest rates of young people not enrolled in education or employment or training. So I think actually as of 2019, we had the highest of any province across the country who'd fall into that. So one of the things that we try to do at Choices for Youth is really invest in that, especially for vulnerable young people. And we would love to continue to see that support, specifically through Employment and Social Development Canada, in training, employment, education for those who are at the highest risk, those who have been disconnected from the labor market for all kinds of reasons, investment in not only their training, upskilling, rapid employment, but also all the conditions that are required to ensure that they maintain that employment. And for the youth who we support, that includes mental health, housing, family, natural supports, and basic needs. So that's one thing we would like to continue to see that investment through Employment and Social Development Canada. And I think the other piece that both Rob and Hope have touched on is investments in rapid access to housing funding. So we were really happy to see CMHC and the investments around seed funding. So many of our partners across the province, and we experience it ourselves as a large nonprofit too, talk about, yep, I know there's, the HAF that's out there. There was a Rapid Housing Initiative that was out there federally. There's money available provincially for housing, but I don't have the capacity to fill out an application, and they're often arduous applications. So the investment in seed funding to be able to support the process of applying to these things and figuring out, what application do I need to go for? What's the process? When do I need to get architectural drawings done up? What are the permitting processes I need to be considering? I think that's a really great investment. I would love to see more of that. And I would also love to see investments in programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative. They did 2 rounds of that, which was available for nonprofit organizations who had the interest capacity through seed funding, for example, to be able to build quickly. And we were able to build 14 units of affordable housing for pregnant and parenting young women through Rapid Housing Initiative. And with more investment like that, we could build more as well.
Go for it.
The Rapid Housing Initiative is notable too because it was 100% grant funding, whereas both some of the recent announcement from the provincial budget and much of the funding through the National Housing Strategy is at best a combination of grants and loans. So again, we don't have the details about the provincial program, but it does say we're investing in loans. Yeah. And in general, federal programs are at the very best half and half. So you have to pay that money back, right? They're not giving it to you. And so I think an emphasis on more grants is also really important. So as we want to increase the supply and we want to make sure that we have long-term affordability, making sure that people can build with less cost is very, very important.
As we hit this part of the show, it's around the time when I say, do you have any final thoughts? Rob, do you have any final thoughts on this today?
I think, the report that we did, that Hope wrote and researched is an incredible step forward in understanding what needs to be done. But as we've been talking about, we need to do 2 things in tandem: increase our understanding around these issues and act. There's no better time to act than right now. If it wasn't yesterday, and we need to act in this space, and we need to act in it together. So that's why the 3 of us are around this table. That's why we've been in conversation with Minister Hutton and the feds, and we're cautiously optimistic around this, but we all need to work hand in hand.
Jen?
I think right now I appreciated your question around the targets, Adam, and recognizing that Fred Hutton, Minister Hutton, is very new to his role. This is the time for us to be ambitious, to set ambitious targets, to act as national leaders in this space. We have a clear problem in front of us. There's a number of solutions that have been outlined in this report, but ultimately it will take a coordinated effort for us to say, however many thousands of units that we need to build by 2030, how do we act across community, provincial government, municipal government, and federal government to take a coordinated approach to attacking that problem? Newfoundland and Labrador is so special in the sense that we have a relatively small population, right? We are just the right size to be able to take innovative approaches to addressing complex problems. And I hope that we are able, across systems, to rise to that challenge and do exactly that when it comes to addressing housing insecurity.
In a spot where most the decision makers know each other by first name, you'd think pick up a phone and get stuff done might be a little easier. Hope Jameson, final word to you, 30 seconds.
I was really intentional about structuring the recommendations by cost and by time. And so we need to do a lot of work in the short term, and we also need to zoom out and think about coordinating our efforts over the long term. And I think doing both of those things in tandem is so important. So I would end with a call to do both those things at the same time. Come on, let's go.
Hope Jameson, Rob Nolan, Jen Crow, thank you very much for this today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
And for the rest of you, the signal at cbc.ca if you want to send us a note with your thoughts or questions. Text line as well, 709-327-8206, or you can leave us a message, 709-576-5260. I'm away tomorrow. The Andrew Hawthorne will be in for me. The topic, conservation, community-driven nature conservancy. You'll hear about how hectares upon hectares of public municipal lands are now recognized as protected areas, and you'll find out why that is so important. Until tomorrow, thanks for listening.